Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the International Society for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect. We thank you for joining us today and appreciate all you're doing to help children during this difficult time. For the hundreds of millions of children engaged in sport, the COVID-19 pandemic brought a stop to this important dimension of their lives. Today's speakers will focus on the impact that this loss has had on children and present highlights from a paper published by the Center for Sport and Human Rights that brings together the findings, perspectives, and concerns of 37 experts and practitioners in the fields of child rights, protection, and safeguarding in sport. Three of the paper's authors will discuss the impact of COVID on the physical and mental health of child athletes and on those children for whom sport is a safe haven, the surge of eSports, and also the implications of child athletes in vulnerable situations. Good practices from around the world will be shared, as well as a call to action. Right now, I have the audience on mute to avoid background noise. We welcome you to please enter any questions or comments you have in the questions box throughout the presentation. The presenters will respond to those at the end as time permits. The recording of today's webinar and the slides will also be posted on the ISPCAN website for a limited time after the webinar. Then they will be archived and available for members only. Kirsty Burrows is the founder of Sports Rights Solutions Limited and consultant to the International Olympic Committee. Her work includes the prevention of harassment and abuse in sport, the protection and promotion of elite athlete mental health, and improving access and opportunities for women and girls in sport. She is also a member of the Council of Europe's Pro-Safe Sport pool of experts who focus on procedure, policy, and strategy for keeping athletes safe. Dr. Olawale Mayegun is a public policy expert and independent consultant. A former ambassador and career diplomat in the Nigerian Foreign Service, he is also the former director of the Department of Social Affairs of the African Union Commission. He has published works on health, child rights, and migration. His current research focus is on the intersection of human rights and sport in Africa. He has particular interest in the migration and trafficking of young African athletes, including documenting human rights risks and collecting accurate data for evidence-based mitigation and remedy policies. And finally, Dr. Daniel Rind is a chartered psychologist and a reader in psychology at Loughborough University. Daniel's research focuses on understanding the development and maintenance of healthy and effective relationships in sport. His research was fundamental in the development of the international safeguards for children in sport, which are now endorsed by more than 100 organizations around the world. Thank you to all of our presenters for being with us today. Now I will turn it over to Kirsty, who is our first presenter. One moment, please.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for this invitation to present to you today. I hope you can now see my screen. I hope it's the full slide and not the notes section, so that you're able to get the full impact of each of the slides. But as I said, myself, Olawale, and Daniel are thrilled to be here today to present to you on a paper that, as Heather mentioned, was published in the summer related to an overview of the sport-related impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on children. And we speak also on, excuse me, sorry, Heather?
Sorry, Kirsty, to interrupt. So we do see your notes right now on the screen. I don't know if there's something you can do to make it full screen.
This is the as fullest screen as I can go, unfortunately.
Okay. That's all right. Just wanted to check on that. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Well, otherwise we can just, as long as you see this side, it's I think we'll have to make do from that from now, unless I can go here to the full screen option. How is that? Is that better?
Oh, almost. I think maybe just one more click if you can. There should be a presentation. There we go. Perfect. Thank you.
Fantastic. Apologies for that. So as mentioned, we're going to do a short introduction and overview. We'll then be looking at talking through the impacts associated with the absence of sport, the impacts on children in special situations, and other impacts, and a call to action. So as was mentioned before, this paper that was published was the collective effort of 37 experts in child protection, child's rights experts, athlete safeguarding experts, who all collaborated and responded to a call from the Centre of Sports and Human Rights to come together and really look at the impact that the absence of sport was having on sport-related. Hello? There's a little bit of interference. As long as that's not Heather telling me something's gone wrong again, we should be okay.
No, we're good.
Fantastic. So looking at the sports-related impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and specifically children. So what has sports got to do with it? So we all know that sports has the potential to impact child rights, both in sport, through sport, and around sport. And you may be familiar with the Action Plan, which has been developed to see how sport can be associated and can help to develop through the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So how does sport have an impact on children? Well, in sport, we can ensure that children can participate safely within the sporting context. Through sport, so this looks at how sport has the potential to empower children beyond the direct context of sport, and around sport. So this looks at how sport can indirectly affect the lives of children. And what we're seeing with the COVID-19 pandemic is that each of these three areas are being affected. We know that as well as education systems, school systems, sports systems and networks have been widely disrupted as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And what we wanted to do was then see how this was having an impact upon the welfare of children. So I'll first talk about the impact associated with the absence of sport before passing on to my colleagues who will talk about the impact of children in special situations and other impacts in the call to action. So firstly, sport is a safe haven. We know that sport is a microcosm of society, and everyone, I'm sure, will be very well aware that what happens in society therefore happens in sport. So it's well known that harassment and abuse occurs in sport. It occurs in sport throughout across the world. It occurs in all sports discipline, and we know that, for example, some athletes are more at risk, for example, child athletes. This is because there are certain factors of sport which can perpetuate harassment and abuse. This is things like, for example, a win at all cost culture, a medals-based culture, the hierarchical nature of sport. It can mean that situations of harassment and abuse occur in sport, and we know that through evidence and through testimony as well. However, as I mentioned at the beginning, sport is a microcosm of society, and we also know that globally it's estimated that 1 billion children aged 2 to 17 years have experienced some form of physical, sexual or emotional violence or neglect in the past year. And that's in society, not just related to sports. We also know, for example, that 1 in 5 children in Europe is the victim of some form of sexual violence. So whilst we know that harassment and abuse occurs in sport, and definitely there is a huge role for sports organisations here to ensure safe spaces for children, we also know that sport can provide a safe haven, which due to shelter in place and quarantine policies has been taken away. So just some quotes here. Contact to our helpline about the impact of domestic abuse on children have increased by 32% during the COVID pandemic. This is from the National Society Protection of Cruelty to Children in the UK. A national assessment revealed beatings by parents or guardians had increased by 42%, and there was a 40% increase of calls to the child helpline. This was a World Vision report related to Bangladesh. And the third quote is not coming up on my screen. Here we go. Up to 85 million more girls and boys worldwide have been exposed to physical, sexual and or emotional violence over 3 months as a result of COVID-19 quarantine. So we know that children at home are more at risk, and that some of the stay-at-home and quarantine policies have placed children and young people at more risk. And we also know that sometimes sport can be a safe haven, and that a lot of sports organisations can sometimes provide that psychological and physical safe space, and that space has been taken away. We also know that the hiatus of sport means that there is a very important opportunity for sports organisations who don't have policies in place to ensure that their environment is one of a safe sporting environment, to ensure that they use this time to ensure those safeguards in place so that children do return sport can be their safe haven and can be a place where any form of violence, whether it be happening within the sporting context or outside of the sporting context, can be recognised and reported and access to remedy. So the next point I'm going to speak about briefly, this is a quote from the UN Policy Brief saying that what began as a health crisis risks evolving into a broader child's rights crisis. And I'm sure I don't need to say that to you, being everybody on this floor very much working in this area. But as I said, this was us trying to look at the sports-related impacts as well and the role that sports can play also in protecting children. So the next thing to talk about is the mental health impact. So the studies have reported psychiatric manifestations of the COVID-19 pandemic and threats to mental health. We also know that evidence demonstrates that sports participation may protect against mental health symptoms and disorders. And there is evidence that underpins this. It's therefore logical that the restrictions of sport participation may be having a detrimental impact to young people's mental health and well-being. This includes increases in loneliness, in depression, in the fact that there's absence away from normal structures, from teams, the inability to participate in physical activity, and just considering the benefit that physical activity has on people's mental health anyway. So the University of Oxford recently published this little infographic, which I thought was really interesting, showing that parents and carers of primary school age children taking part in a survey have reported an increase in their child's emotional, behavioural and restlessness and difficulties as well. And the last area I'm going to speak briefly to is physical health and nutrition. So of course there are direct physical health consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic on children. And we also highlighted that there is an indirect risk posed through the restriction of participation in sport and physical activity. Of course, at the moment, it's too soon to say or to be able to quantify this risk or to qualify, but we do know that with the heavy disruption of sports and physical activities, both in school, in organised sports, in teams and clubs, this may very well have an impact on the physical health of young people all around the world. And in addition, we have to think about the impact of the absence of sport and education, particularly on nutrition. So we know that good nutrition is essential for physical and mental well-being and in sport. And we know that the COVID-19 pandemic has placed children from low-income households and countries at a nutritional risk. And this is especially important for those where school meals or meals or systems that are in place through sport actually augment or are a huge part of the nutritional intake of children or part of their daily routine. And this is going to be very, very important for sports organisations when sport restarts and children come back and start returning to play sports. So that's a little whistle-stop tour from my part. I'm now going to pass over to my colleague who will be talking about the impact on children in special situations. Over to you,
Thank you very much, Kirsty, and thanks to everyone for all those who put this together. I'm going to quickly follow up in your presentation, and thanks to all the people who joined us, for this webinar. I'll be looking at children in vulnerable and special situations. All children are vulnerable, but there are children who are in more vulnerable and special situations with higher risk factors of being heavily impacted by COVID-19. And I have them broadly into three groups, as you've seen on the screen. The first group includes children from poor and low-income household communities on unsafe home environments and with high demographic
Hello? Hold on, everyone. It seems we're having some audio issues. Kirsty or Daniel, can you hear Olawale?
No, but I'm still here. I can't hear him.
Okay.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay. I don't know where I stopped. Good. I said, I'm quickly trying to divide the group into three, and to say that the first group includes children from poor or low-income household communities or unstable home environments, and with high demographic density, as well as those residing in rural areas, especially in developing countries. And children in this social economic group are most likely living in situations where social distancing or social or physical distancing has not been practiced, nor is it possible, and may also be aggravated by systemic racism and inequality in some countries. The second group are vulnerable children in special situations that are negatively affected. They include the girl child, children with disabilities, and kids in humanitarian situations. And I mean kids who are refugees, migrants, IDPs, that is internally displaced, kids with higher mortality and comorbidity rates. The third group are children in sports academy and elite sports. Though they are from different social economic backgrounds, nevertheless, they are all vulnerable to exploitation, abuse, punishing training schedules, and little contact with their families. And of course, they are also subjected or vulnerable to trafficking and smuggling. So for these vulnerable children, as Kirsty had pointed out, who are fortunate to be active in sports, as Kirsty has pointed out, sport is often their lifeline, and COVID-19 has taken away the safe space and social, economic, and social emotional outlet that their participation in sports may have provided. Of course, sports can be a powerful tool for promoting a sense of inclusion, particularly for children with disability, children at risk of child labor, and the girl child who is more susceptible to child marriage, FGM, and related harmful practices. With COVID-19, children in sports academy and elite sports may face not only possibility of shattered dreams, but also the academies may not be respecting their commitments due to financial difficulties. And this session will examine a brief more into details. Let me go to the next slide, and there I'll be talking more about those children in vulnerable, in vulnerable and special, in low and poor income homes. Here I'm going to be focusing on magnifying inequalities because it's one of the biggest impacts of COVID-19. Schools closures may most likely have not even may most likely, it has magnified, and we are already seeing the outcome, the problem of access and participation in mass sport at the grassroots level, and hence extenuate existing inequalities. These systemic inequalities can be associated with family income or living in rural or urban areas. We've seen in the case of the United States here, for instance, during the pandemic, the difference between public and private schools, and in terms of access to the internet. In the UK, we gave the example of the UK. Before COVID-19, children from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups, called BAME backgrounds, were less likely to take part in physical activities. And according to the findings of the survey published by Sports England, of the more than 57,000 children between the ages of 5 and 16 years old that were surveyed about their exercise habit, only 45% are active for at least 60 minutes a day, while the number for children from BMAE backgrounds is even lower. The same reports indicate that brain functions better after physical activities and help children learn better. COVID-19, school closures, and shelter in place has most likely increased the existing gap between white, British, and BAME children. Again, also the inequality in access to sports and education is also manifested in health. While COVID-19 does not discriminate in contagion, there have been huge differences in the mortality and morbidity outcome. I'm quoting from the CDC, the US CDC here. People of color and the poor have suffered disproportionately. While data gathering and research are ongoing to explain the phenomena, it is likely that social and economic determinants will be important factors and also important related to such factors as health inequalities and genetics. Again, we have seen in the United States and around the world how COVID-19 has unmasked the inequalities and iniquities that have existed for hundreds of years. The thousands of people protesting around the world against systemic racism and in support of the Black Lives Matter movement during the pandemic, even at the risk to their health, has brought these inequalities and iniquities into even sharper focus, forcing sports organizations to rethink and begin to take concrete measures to tackle racism in sport. In effect, there is a good opportunity to significantly improve the participation at all levels of sport for minorities, women, children, and vulnerable groups. What about girls? What about the girl child? It's another, in the next slide. What about the girl child? For the girl child, usually more than, they are more than vulnerable, than boys to sexual violence at home. I'm quoting from the United Nations. Maybe spending 24 hours per day, 7 days a week with recurrent abusers, increasing their exposure to violence and their levels of fear and stress. Others may be facing physical and sexual abuse for the first time in their lives. As previous crises like the Ebola outbreak, which I had the privilege of not only participating, but leading the Africa's effort, we've seen the rates of unintended pregnancies, child marriage, human trafficking for sexual exploitation among children and adolescent girls are likely to increase. At the same time, during the lockdown and social isolation measures, girls are having less access to sexual and reproductive health care or to gender-based violence services that in many places aren't even considered to be essential services. Again, there are so many other aspects, and I refer us to it. But let me quickly touch on kids with disabilities. According to the UN, children with disabilities may be disproportionately, not that they are actually disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 outbreaks, as they are at greater risk of contracting the disease and developing more severe health conditions, dying from the disease, and facing discrimination in accessing healthcare and life-saving procedures. This concern is based on the presence across the wider population of comorbidities such as hypertension, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease associated with the worst prognosis and mortality for COVID-19, with attendant risk for long and lasting or permanent damage. There is also another confounding part of the issues with children with disability as an umbrella term, which represent extremely diverse population with different impairments and support requirements who face significant barriers in exercising their rights to sport and physical activities. For instance, some groups face even greater marginalization, such as children with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities, or children who are deaf, blind. These children are more likely to be excluded from programs, live, or to be detained in institutions and experience higher rates of violence, neglect, and abuse. And of course, again, let me refer you to the article that we've written, and you can read more. But let me quickly talk about kids in humanitarian situation. The impact of COVID-19 is the harshest for those groups who are ultimately already in vulnerable situation, even before the crisis, such as many of these kids on the move, those of them who are already in regular situations, some are in migrant detention camps, and some are working in informal economy. The fear that the camps where they are will be affected has made quite a substantial number of them to be vulnerable to trafficking. And as we're already saying, to trafficking. And with the pandemic, humanitarian assistance has virtually stopped in giving assistance to those kids. Let me quickly also go to the last slide, which is children with in academy, in sports academy. COVID-19 has affected the sports academies around the world, with most of them closing down temporarily due to lockdowns and shelter-in-place measures. However, there are few of them that will close permanently. We've had that from the US Soccer Federation, for instance, has permanently shut down its Youth Development Academy, founded in 2009. With this statement, the extraordinary and unanticipated circumstances around COVID-19 pandemic have resulted in a financial situation on and on and on. There are questions around the well-being of children residing in sports academy and training. Remember, quite a number of them around the world have left their homes, they've missed their parents, and there is a question of what happens to them after the academy has reopened. There's so many questions that remain unanswered about these kids. Will these minors have to reimburse the cost of the academy incurred? Where will they go to? How will the exacerbated risk of children in limbo be addressed? For example, trafficked children stranded with no clubs or academy recruiting them. And we have many of these cases, especially with soccer clubs around the world. The full extent of the impact on these children may not be fully known until after the academies have been reopened or long after the epidemic is gone. The same thing with kids in, the child athletes in elite sports. For so many of them, it's a shattered dream already. The Olympics has been postponed, like Casti, mentioned, and as my other colleague we discussed, they've been cancelled. I mean, some of them who are injured even before COVID-19, they face so many risks that it's not surprising that of recent, you could see in the United States that given the confusion over the opening of schools, reopening, quite a number of parents are beginning to look for school districts where their children can practice sports so that they can keep the dream alive, especially in the elite something. Some have been moving from one state to another, from one, searching for school districts where the disruption in education and schooling, including the postponement of exams, will lead to pressure for young athletes to focus on school and education at the expense of sports participation and training. And again, we're already seeing this. The debate over school reopening has not even taken cognizance, except in colleges, of sports activities. So with schools reopening, this is being taken to the background. But above all, let's keep in mind, as I give the floor to Daniel, that already in developing countries, there is continue to be that magnifying inequalities. Even here, in developed countries, kids from poorer homes cannot participate, even in the online, where they could. There's been complained that some of them, just check the recent article in New York Times about 2 or 3 days ago, that kids could not even participate online. Why? Because they are taking care of other siblings, and they're most likely going to be girl child. In India, in Kenya, in many of the African countries and developing world, kids are now engaged in child labor because of the COVID, and school has become less priority, not to talk of sports. I stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Olawale. I'm Daniel Rhines. I'm in the centre of England at the moment, a wet and cold England. So a very good morning, afternoon or evening, wherever you are in the world. I'll be reiterating some of the points that Kirsty and Olawale have made and looking at some perhaps more indirect threats or risks that you might not initially think of when you think of sport, and also some opportunities, and then ending with some calls to action. So the first key slide to talk about is eSports, and the impact on our lives of technology in this time of COVID has been remarkable, even to the extent of I spend my life now in MS Teams meetings or Zoom and webinars such as this. So it's had those positive impacts, even in terms of physical activity. We had someone in England called Joe Wicks, a personal trainer that was on every morning at 9 o'clock doing PE classes, and he had 1 million people tuning in every morning to do that class with him from their front room. So technology has had massive positive links to sport, but also some more negative implications as well, particularly maybe in eSports. As you'll be aware, there's a massive growth in that area, particularly now that people have been more at home over the last 6 months, and the growth of competitions and children being in their bedrooms and playing these sports. And what's starting to emerge now is evidence of how this context can actually threaten children's well-being, when often people think, well, if a child is at home, most children are safe, whereas in this case they can be at home safe, but the access to the internet can lead them to having safeguarding risks. So one study that's cited on the slide there of young girls who are gamers said that 1 in 3 had experienced some form of abuse or harassment. And when you read that paper, it ranges from verbal abuse and criticism right through to threats of rape, really extreme kind of cases of abuse, because they develop a profile and people can access them relatively easy through social media. So it does jeopardize people's well-being in that sense. And really it's thinking about how do we regulate that space in terms of what lessons can we learn from sport when it's done in a physical context? How can we put things online in the same way that make sure that there are policies in place, procedures for managing safeguarding concerns, background checks, and those kind of things that we would put in place normally? How can we make sure that eSports and e-athletes that generate these high profiles are safe, but also any child that happens to play a sports game that when I was young, it used to be very much you play the game in your house. There was no internet. It was a solitary kind of game, or maybe with a friend in the room. Now you can play online with millions of people all around the world. So it creates these extra threats. And with COVID, more children now are going online, playing these sports games, perhaps to some extent meeting the need for sport that they haven't been able to meet by playing it in the real world. So they play it online. So eSports is an opportunity, but also there's threats that need to be managed. So moving on to the financial implications, and I mean, nobody would be able to have missed the kind of massive earthquake, if you like, into the financial settings all around the world of the economies that are going into recession in many countries, if not globally. And clearly that will filter down to impact children at all levels. Starting at the top level in terms of governments, clearly more people are going to be unemployed now, and therefore there'll be less tax income coming in and more strains on the social welfare budget. So will sport become jeopardized because of that? Will budgets mean that sport gets less funding? Likewise with companies, maybe their profits being hit. Can they spend money on sponsorship that they might have done that filters through into participation sports or getting children into sport in the first place? Right down to families, clearly people losing their jobs or strains on the income, that may threaten things that could get cut from what children do. So will there be less money for children to access sports or have the equipment or be able to travel to participate, etc., etc. So every level you can think of, from the national right down to individual families in their homes, there's going to be financial implications that prevent access to sport from young people. But often what we wanted to highlight as well is that sport can clearly have massive benefits that if we just see sport as a cost and a financial cost, we miss out on all those great benefits that sport can have. So financially, you can actually create benefits by investing in sport and getting more people to be physically active, and ultimately that saves money in terms of healthcare and so on, or developing life skills and confidence in young people that ultimately have benefits to them. So sports cannot just be seen as a cost, but also as a potential opportunity that needs investing, and not something that's just an additional line on a budget that needs to be cut because our overall amount of money we've got to spend is less. And as Aliwali mentioned, there's clear research there that links that those in the people from lower income families may have less access to sport. So with everyone's overall income going down, there'll be more and more children who cross that line into poverty, and maybe their access to sport goes down, and their children's rights to play and leisure from the UN Convention, there'll be less children that are enjoying that right and having it realised. So financially, clearly, there's going to be a massive hit on children directly and indirectly. So moving on to education, again, reiterating some of the points really that my fellow speakers have mentioned, but schools all around the world being closed down, virtually all children would have been impacted by that directly. But what's interesting now is the discourse is that when we start to see reopening schools in England, there's talking about children need to catch up, and there's often mention of core subjects. So we need extra time now for them to talk about English or maths or science, and they're seen as the core subjects, we need extra lessons, but never does sport come into that context. It's sort of seen as a nice addition or an extra activity, and we're not having any talk of we need extra sport to make up for the sport that's lost, or extra lessons in PE and so on. So sport is sort of seen as a lesser activity compared to those core subjects. So will it become sacrificed to make room on the curriculum for these other activities? So that's a real concern that the value of sport is not seen within that school setting. And likewise, the extracurricular activities, because of a whole range of factors you can imagine, will schools have those programs that maybe run after school, the extra activities because of the finances or the logistical challenges of running those sessions? Will they become cut, at least in the short term, until they work out how to do it? So schools is often the main way in which many children, I would say in this country, and I imagine other countries, that children have access to physical activity and sport. And if that becomes cut, then the amount of children who don't do any physical activity will increase even further than it is at the moment. So education is a clear setting where, again, there's those risks, but also opportunities where children are starting to go back now. Can sport be seen as important as the other areas of the curriculum and maintain its place that it had before? So moving on to opportunities, will people, now that they've had sport taken away from them, actually appreciate sport more? I know in this country we were allowed to go out for once a day to do exercise. Actually, many people weren't doing that before the kind of epidemic really hit. But the fact that they were told to go out once a day to do their hour of exercise, actually more people were doing that and engaging that. So can people now engage with that and keep that habit going? And as I mentioned, with the Joe Wicks and the P, that a million of people tuned in to watch that, and many of them would never have done physical activity on a regular basis before. So can people, now it's been taken away to some extent, will they value that, and will any habits that they've changed be maintained to help keep that physical activity? There's an opportunity there to harness this, and so we don't want that to be missed. Likewise, there's been amazing collaboration, not only with us putting together this paper from Dorothy at the Centre for Sport and Human Rights having the idea, to actually publishing the paper was maybe only a month to 5-6 weeks. We kind of got all the evidence, wrote it all together, 40 different organisations. So there's clear collaborations there, as well as people like laureates who are establishing networks to share resources and create funds to help sport build back better. So it's in that time of crisis often brings out the best in people. So there's been a lot of collaboration and networking, and people not competing anymore, but actually working together to share best practice and so on. So that's something that's been a good thing that we can hopefully harness and go forward. Likewise, seen examples of clearly hygiene being more of a in people's minds as they build back to sport. So that's something that could be a good practice that's kept. And so we saw some really interesting and heartening examples, actually. So, for example, many people wearing masks now when they go back to play sport, and clearly with a coach having a mask on, suddenly a child that lip reads, has hearing problems, they're instantly excluded just by the safeguard you're putting in place of a mask. You're excluding children who can't hear. So we've seen some innovations of designers who created masks with a transparent area around the lip so the children could still lip read. So that really put sort of disability back on the map and the issues of inclusion. So again, in those times of crisis, actually it created innovations that hadn't been there before. So hopefully that can be maintained, that people are now suddenly aware of inclusion where they might not have thought about it before. They're now aware of that something as an issue. They can think beyond just the COVID into other areas of their life. And likewise, we're involved, a project that's been ongoing really since 2012 is we've developed the International Safeguards for Children in Sport. So there are 8 key areas, and many of you are practitioners, they would be common sense to you, but actually in sport, many organisations don't have things like a safeguarding policy or procedures for managing concerns or training. So it's about having those things that you would be familiar with, many in sport hadn't really put in place before. So now we're trying to see this as an opportunity to build back better and build back safer, to say this is an opportunity to refresh all of what you're doing and take the time to think, is sport safe? What can we do as this opportunity where we've had this pause to make sure that we're ready when it comes back again, that it's a better experience than it was before. So the Safeguards provides a framework and a freely available implementation guide to help organisations to hopefully use as an opportunity to make children safer than they would have been before the COVID outbreak. So coming towards the end of my section, really, we've got these calls to action that clearly many recommendations flow from the paper that we've written, but we've just highlighted 9 here, and clearly you can read them in more detail in the paper if you want to. As you'd imagine, more research. A lot of what we've talked about is we've shown the research where we can, but often it's anecdotal or something we've used as a common sense kind of assumption, but there's still a lack of research globally in terms of what is the impact being on the children in terms of all these risks, what actually has been the evidence. There may well be additional threats that we haven't thought about, as well as opportunities. So more research is clearly needed there. How can stakeholders put things in place to mitigate these impacts? So we've a whole range of threats there. So how can we support people to identify the risks in their own context, put measures in place, and then monitor and evaluate to see if they're actually working or not. So we need to engage with stakeholders all around sport to work to mitigate these threats. And then guidance to support these efforts. Clearly, a lot of sport people are volunteers. They're not experts in these areas. They know about the coaching side or the sport management side, but all of these areas and try and have clear guidance, which is not often something we have around COVID at the moment in terms of do you wear a mask, do you not wear a mask, what's safe, what isn't safe. So sport needs to make sure that its guidance is very clear and supportive to organisations to help them to create a safe space. And building that capacity to support children back. Clearly, many will have had various forms of traumatic experience over these last 6 months that Kirsty and Oliwale talked about. So sport coming back as a safe haven, children may well have experienced negative things over the summer, whether it's harassment or abuse or poverty, whatever it happens to be. How can sport be supported to support those children and create that safe space for them back to get some sort of normality back in life and support those that do need additional support? Again, how can we listen to children? We would like to have done this in this project, but it's something that still needs to be done, is how can we engage with children on actually what their experiences have been of COVID and of coming back to sport. What are their concerns or ideas or innovations that would help them engage with sport more effectively? Again, build back better is something I mentioned on that previous slide. How can we actually use this as a way of making sport even better than it was before, rather than trying to get back to the old normal? Let's create a new normal that's even better. And again, highlighting that need that sport can actually have those benefits. It's not just a cost that we can cut off a budget line, but rather it can help us achieve all sorts of things for individuals, from psychosocial to physical benefits, right through to more global efforts such as the Sustainable Development Goals 2030. Sport links to many of those goals and can help us achieve many of the areas that we're trying to get to. So we need to make sure we amplify that message. And if children are concerned when they come back, how do they report that? Not only the safeguarding concerns, but more broadly, if they're concerned about any aspect of COVID, how do they voice that? How can that best be managed? And then how can we build resilience so that if this, hopefully not this or similar things happen in the past, what can we learn from these experiences that sport can play a role in making individuals or families or communities or countries more resilient to such global threats should they happen in the future? So a lot of depressing realities, but a lot of also areas of hope and opportunity as well. So the 4 papers there, as I mentioned, that you can read and kind of go through this in more detail. That's the end of the presentation. So we'll pause there to see what questions have come through. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, all 3 of you, for sharing this important information with us today. I'm going to take the screen back here. We do have some questions from the audience. Okay, so as I'm doing that, okay, so let me start here with a question. This is about equal opportunity for kids to succeed in sports. This attendee is asking, what can we try to, or what can we do to try to ensure better equality of opportunity to succeed for children who are elite athletes, given the increased divides among nations because of COVID? I'm not sure who would like to take that one. Maybe Kirsty?
Just thinking, so sorry, could you, so the question is related to?
Yes, I think she's asking about children who are elite athletes and kind of the divide that's happening perhaps around the world due to COVID in terms of opportunity. She's asking, what can we do to try to ensure better equality of opportunity to succeed during this time?
Well, it's a really, really good question, and I think this is a huge role where sports organisations need to look into. I mean, we know that there are many programs that are happening at the moment. Lots of international federations who are going and looking at trying to support national federations and sports for development programs that are happening on the ground. I think the most important thing is to ensure that we can try as sports organisations or as people who advise sports organisations, look to try and support sports organisations to know how they can bring children back safely, and how they can implement measures and mechanisms which will allow children to participate in sport without increasing the burden so much that it increases that divide effectively, and increases those barriers to safe sport participation. So I think it's a very, very good point. I don't know if any of the other authors might want to say a few words on that as well. Oluwale, perhaps?
Yeah, I can pick up on that unless Oluwale's got a particular point. I think it's clearly, as a researcher, I would be thinking about how we can engage with those athletes and give them a voice. So whether it's engaging with them individual directly, or whether it's the unions or the player associations, about how we liaise with athlete representatives to identify those inequalities and what can be done about them, and likewise identifying good practice. So what are people doing in countries or sports that other people can learn from to remove those inequalities? So how can we identify those and amplify those, that people understand not just the problem, but we also provide them a solution as well. But often listening to the athlete is something that's always going to be good practice.
Yeah, that's a great point, Daniel.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's see, let's move on to a different topic. This person is asking if you could explain a little more about the concept of sport as a safe haven for children. I know you
Sure.
probably all touched on that, but yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Effectively, what we're looking at ensuring is that, we know that harassment and abuse occurs within society, and we know very much as well through evidence and testimony that it also happens in sport. What we also know, though, and working actually with some survivors of abuse in sport, I remember very clearly one gentleman turning around and saying, for some people, sport is their only safe space. So we know that for children who are the victims of forms of violence, sexual violence or physical violence, most of them know their perpetrator, that someone with very, very closely within their circle. And sport has the opportunity to provide a space, whether it's a sport for development program or whether it's just organized sport, ensuring that safeguards are in place in sporting organizations and sporting teams means that there may be people within that system who can recognize when a child is suffering from any form of harassment and abuse, and may be able to then instigate pathways to actually recognize that and see if they can provide access to remedy and provide a safe place for that person. So effectively, it's trying to say that sport can be, and for many children, it can be a physical and psychological safe space. There is a lot more to be done, and we know this across the sporting spectrum. And Daniel has done some fantastic work developing the international safeguards for children. There are other toolkits, for example, like the IOC toolkit that's been developed on implementing policies and procedures to safeguard children within sport. Definitely, there is a lot more that needs to be done across sporting organisations to ensure that safe sport policies are implemented. But what it means is that for children who are accessing sport and who are participating in sport, it's not only a place where, for example, abuse happening outside of sport might be recognised, but that there might be mechanisms and set policies and procedures and links to statutory agencies to mean that that child could get, or that person could have access to support.
Okay, great. Thank you. This is a question about the children's perspective about this. This person is asking, other than the recommendations coming from sports organizations, administrators, et cetera, do you know of any work, or do you have any recommendations from the voices of children or youth regarding what they suggest or want in response to the pandemic?
I think that's a really interesting question, and it's one that we've often battled with research, because not often all the research in sport and safeguarding and abuse in these areas is often retrospective. So we ask people who are kind of 18 to 24 about the experiences of children, and the reason for that is the ethical challenges, because anybody under 18, you need parental consent, which can be a real challenge, and ethically people it's hard to get research approved because of the potential issues and the sensitive topics. And so because it's only just happened, we don't have that opportunity to have retrospective accounts, but there certainly is that need to work out ways of engaging with current children in a sensitive way about their experiences. But I'm not aware of anybody who's doing that yet, but there's clearly a need for it.
Okay, great. Anyone else have anything else to say on that?
I just had a quick follow-up from what Kirsty said about the safe haven, just to highlight that we did some research in the UK and England about the cases that are currently managed by sport of safeguarding concerns. And actually what was interesting was that 54% of them were related to behaviour outside the sports. So while sport was managing them, over half their cases were safeguarding concerns in the home or the school or something outside of sport. So that shows that sport is not just about making them safe there, but actually sport was a way in which children could disclose concerns, or coaches might notice changes in behaviour. So sport is an important part of the bigger safeguarding system of children alongside other important social settings. So that was an interesting finding, just to support what Kirsty was saying.
Okay, great, thank you. Here's a question. Do you have a sense of, or is there research on specific age groups of children that are perhaps feeling the negative effects or psychological effects of loss of sport more than others?
I think Daniel, you probably have a better answer than me with your background in research, but I would say that at the moment it's very difficult to be able to say definitively because we're still so very much in the thick of it. I would say that, we see different, so we're looking specifically as well at children in organised sport. We might see, for example, children at the age of transition, so effectively children who are at the age of transition 15, 16, 17, 18, also who are more in the elite sports system might be suffering, particularly due to the lack of structure and financial implications and other sorts of implications that the breakdown of sporting networks provides. But we would also see amongst younger children very much an impact in terms of mental and physical health, and the lack of physical activity and the reduction in those social networks that sporting does offer. I don't know whether you might have any more insight from the research perspective on that, Daniel.
No, I think you're right. I think probably children across the ages will be equally impacted, but in different ways. Maybe at the very younger age, maybe it's more the lack of social support or relationships with peers and the general fitness. Through to as you become more elite, it's the more impact on training and schedules and lack of routines and so on, right through to those that were expecting to go to the Olympics and now suddenly their whole 4-year development, they still might be a child, they might be 16, 17 expecting to go to the Olympics, and then suddenly it's all delayed by a year. And a year in a 4-year cycle is a big impact. So I would imagine there's impact at all ages, just manifestations in different ways.
And of course, the delay of the Youth Olympic Games and other sporting events which have been postponed, and that with then an accumulation of multiple sporting events in a shorter sporting calendar will also have an impact when sport comes back. So yeah, definitely.
Okay, thank you. I wonder if one of you can talk about the role of schools with sport. I know in the United States, it's been very inconsistent. Many club sports continued throughout the pandemic. Some sports have shut down completely, some have not. It just kind of depends where you are. So I wonder if you can speak to the role of schools as they reopen in sport, and maybe any recommendations for how they should approach that.
I mean, I don't know if you want to, some of the points that Daniel touched upon really well in his presentation. One of the things that we we see the important role that sport has on children and young people and adults' lives, but we see the huge role that sport can play in multiple areas. You know, the lessons that can be learned through sport, the physical benefits, the mental benefits. And we also know that, as Daniel mentioned in his presentation, as schools come back, it is very likely that there will be more of a focus on some of these key areas, and that some of these lessons that can be learnt through sport and the important role that sport can have in young people's development might be impacted with more of a focus being placed on some of these sort of core curricular subjects. So I think it would just be to note the importance of physical activity on young people in a really holistic context, and to ensure that there is still the possibility for them to have access to sport. We know that it is possible to participate in physical activity safely if you implement the right guidance. And to ensure that this is something that children, the young people, don't go without, recognizing, of course, that schools will be focusing a lot on the core curricular activities, and also recognizing, I think, some of the other points just related to, I mean, as children return back from school, the other social aspects that schools should really keep in mind. For example, the fact that we know there's been an increase around the world of reports of physical violence and other forms of violence within the home, the nutritional impact that we'll be having on children, especially from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And all of these things, I think, have to be integrated within the processes that are put in place as children come back to school and come back to sport.
Okay, thank you. And maybe just one last question. There are a few questions about recommendations for maybe parents or those who work with families on helping to, you know, monitor the well-being of children during this time. And Daniel, you talked about the eSports and the risks that those pose to children. Do you have any general recommendations for parents or those who working with families about talking to children about these risks and about how they're feeling with the loss of sport?
Yeah, I think it's creating that dialogue if you can, and getting children to talk about it, because the irony is it's probably easier than ever before to communicate now with all the technology, but perhaps people communicate actually even less than they used to. So it's perhaps trying to engage with children in the ways that they're used to communicating. So if they're playing games, is there a way in which you can engage with them and talk to them about it and play with them, or can you engage with them through you know, sharing interest in their topics, rather than saying, or you spend too much time on that computer, actually kind of thinking, okay, what are you doing on this game? How can I speak? And that can be maybe, you know, opens the door, if you like, to a conversation to get them talking. And they might not have the language to express how they're feeling. So it's trying to work with them and saying, well, I feel anxious and I feel concerned about this, and trying to give them the language that they can have to express it and work with them on that, rather than as a parent myself, it's so easy to say, put that tablet down, do this and don't do that, rather than actually saying, well, what do you enjoy about it and what you're learning from that, and engaging with them on that level. So I think it's, yeah, communicating in a language and a methods that the children would be more able to do that, perhaps. Although I'm no expert as a parent, it's not easy.
Right. Okay, great. Well, if there are no other comments on that question, I think we're about out of time. So I just want to say thank you again to our three speakers for sharing this information with us today. And thank you everyone who listened in, and also for the questions you sent. If you had a question that did not get answered, we will make sure that the speakers get those questions, and we'll try to get them answered for you as best as we can. So just in conclusion, I would like to encourage all of you to become a member of ISPCAN if you are not already, so that we can continue having webinars like these in the future. Our member benefits include a subscription to our monthly research journal, access to our past webinars and other educational resources, the ISPCAN Child Abuse Screening Tools, or ICAST, and also discounts to our events and congresses, which will resume in 2021. We offer several membership levels, including our new associate membership, which is $35 a year. We also invite you to visit our COVID-19 resources page for a variety of resources for professionals, parents, and children. You'll also find information there about our upcoming webinars. And to learn more about ISPCAN, please visit us at ispcan.org. And a reminder, a recording of today's webinar and the slides will be available on our website shortly. If you have any questions about today's webinar or any upcoming webinars, please contact us at resources@ispcan.org. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Please stay safe and healthy and have a great day or night, depending on where you are. Thank you, Kirsty, Daniel, and Olawale.
Thanks.
Okay, bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.